Here is the Prime Minister of Australia.
As long as they don't touch Mad as Hell, I'm happy.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Now, as you know, the budget is being handed down next week, and in the lead-up, the government have been busy with preparations, lowering our expectations, bagging the Queensland Deputy Premier and reminding us who is really to blame for this country's abysmal economic forecast.
60% of the JobKeeper payments that will be made at the end of this month will be in Victoria.
The end of this month? Well, I guess that's right, given people will be able to afford less food on the reduced JobKeeper payments. Mind you, there might not be all that much to eat anyway, with Woolies warning we could run out of food by Christmas. Although thanks to China clamping down on imports of Australian beef, barley and wine, and now wheat, we might have enough to see us through. So a nice gesture there. Always good to know China has our back, along with our banking details. There have also been plenty of distractions orchestrated by the government to make us forget about the welfare payment cuts and the end of mortgage relief and eviction bans. For example, if you're lucky enough to have a home, you might be in the running to have adequate internet speeds, provided you can afford it. Now, a lot of people have poo-pooed this announcement and said, oh, we could have had that if we voted Kevin Rudd back in the first time we had a chance 7 years ago, instead of this guy, and to a lesser extent, this guy. But as our Minister for Communications, Paul Fletcher, seen here with Mr Broadband at the unveiling of their cheaper, faster and more affordable version, Labor's NBN plan wasn't all it never got a chance to be cracked up to be.
Under Labor's wildly profligate approach, expensive fibre lead-ins were built to every home, whether or not the customer actually wanted broadband at any speed, let alone ultra-fast speeds.
Exactly. I mean, why build a network of pipes to carry water to every house when you don't know whether the customer who currently lives in that house is thirsty? They might not even drink water at all, or if they do, might not want it at off-peak times. Better to let them order that water from a private provider and leave the government to create a system of puddles at the end of our streets which the customers can visit with a bucket. Still, we can't forget, because they keep reminding us all the time, that the coalition government have always been sound economic managers. I mean, when the Australian National Audit Office says the government paid $26.7 million too much for land at Western Sydney Airport, you can imagine how much Labor would have paid for it. And don't we pay too much for everything at the airport anyway? Mind you, this land won't be used until after 2050, and while we all like to get to the airport early just in case, 30 years before the runway is built really pushes the amount of time you can spend browsing through the duty-free. Still, as the government explained, an early purchase would help it capitalise on goodwill from the landowner, a Liberal Party donor who gave $58,000 to the Liberal Party and got $29.8 million for land worth $920,000. So exactly who was capitalising on the goodwill of whom isn't entirely clear, but it's in there somewhere. The other welcome distraction this last week, and another example of forward thinking, was of course Energy Minister Angus Taylor unfolding his technology investment roadmap. The analogue quaintness of roadmap, either an ironic counterpoint to the cutting-edge innovation Angus is talking about, or not. There are 5 key areas of emission-reducing energy investment, and as Angus explained,
the nature of R&D portfolios is that you have to place bets.
But by placing bets on carbon capture and storage, soil carbon, hydrogen batteries and green steel, the government is starting to look like a problem gambler. If it does all its dough on soil carbon, it tries to make it back on green steel. It doesn't know when to stop. The next thing it knows, the federal government hasn't got enough money for American universities and Foxtel and is living under a bridge. As the great philosopher Kenny Rogers once sang, you've got to know when to hold them, know when to fold them, know when to walk away and know when to run. He'd also have added that you've got to know when to have an emissions reduction target, be it in 2030, 2035 or 2050, but obviously that's a very awkward line to make scan and rhyme with. Anyway, still to come, just as Angus Taylor gave us 5 areas of energy investment, Josh Frydenberg gave us 5 adjectives to describe Paul Keating's most recent attack on the Reserve Bank.
Nasty, personal, vindictive, unnecessary, misguided.
All the things we love about Paul Keating in Parliament. We also look at this comment by the Treasurer.
We as a government value the independence of the Reserve Bank when it comes to monetary policy.
Though considering what they paid for this, should this government really be valuing anything? Also still to come, we sent Francis Greenslade into the ABC foyer to smoke some meth. It's a disgusting habit and we won't allow him to do it in the studio. Plus, climate change and glaciers are starting to fight back. Also, with the hotel quarantine inquiry winding up in Victoria, we ask, are the ADF the best qualified to test for COVID-19?
Jason, real gun, mate.
Oh, shit. Sorry.
The other big question about the ADF is, as far as the federal government is concerned, who offered to send them to whom in Victoria and when and for what purpose, and who said no and why it was Daniel Andrews. Viceroy Cabin Boy Sabobo Gargle, as a proud military man or woman, it must gall you to see the ADF being used as pawns in this game of political hungry hippos.
Defending this country is not a game, Shaun, and it offends me to the core of my very being to be treated that way. Someone's dropped the ball here and they need to be sin-binned before the siren sounds. Well,
Sky News got a leak of explosive letters written directly by Scott Morrison offering 1,000 troops to Victoria.
Yes, and when I find out who leaked the private correspondence between Scott Morrison and Daniel Andrews that supports Scott Morrison's narrative to one of his preferred media organisations, you can rest assured I'll be keeping it to myself. But the important thing here is that troops were offered. Yes, it was after the second wave had begun, and yes, it was for street patrols with police and not quarantine, and it probably wouldn't have made any difference. But it does form an intriguing jumping-off point for both rabid News Corps editorials and the first of my series of erotic alternative history novels about a young vice-rear cabin boy pounding the beat with nothing but a police officer and a glow-in-the-dark thermometer.
And now, of course, the Deputy Queensland Premier has released letters asking the PM to keep troops in Queensland before he went and removed them anyway.
Ah, and you're wondering if Dan Andrews knew this is how the PM works and was actually using negative psychology and effectively asking for troops by refusing them.
Otherwise, why is the PM trying to send troops when he's not asked and withdrawing them when he is?
Well, Shaun, the PM can't just send troops into the states in the face of opposition. That would be an act of war. But declaring an unconditional retreat in defiance of an invitation to stay is one of the greatest powers still in the hands of the PM.
If only there were a way to retreat forwards.
Yes, then we couldn't just pull troops out. We could retreat them back in!
Oh, Mickey, you're so fine, you're so fine, you blow my mind. Hey, Mickey. Hey, Mickey. Oh, Mickey, you're so fine, you're so fine, you blow my mind.
Now, we've heard a lot about sovereignty over the last few months, and not just from people filming themselves being arrested at Bunnings or as they're dragged from their cars at police checkpoints. We've also heard it from our Prime Minister, Scott Morrison, as he's gently browbeaten, gaslit and bullied the states to open up their borders, raise the caps on returning Australians and generally kneel before him as the one true Sun King, whose every whim is law, or what passes for it these days. But sovereignty is a two-way street. What was given to the Commonwealth by the states 120 years ago at Federation can sometimes be returned when it's too much bother, like the federal government moving its environmental powers back to the states, for example. Coming up later, I asked political naturalist Lindy B. Ankle, isn't it more helpful and less complicated for our flora and fauna to be inadequately looked after by a single authority rather than inadequately looked after by 8 different ones from various states and, to a lesser extent, territories?
Shaun, the Commonwealth looks after artificial man-made things like the economy and, to a lesser extent, climate change. But when it comes to the wild, untamed beauty of our river system, forest and native animals that weren't fricasseed last Christmas, then it's best to just let nature be.
Won't different sets of environmental protection laws lead to uncertainty? Companies with projects that rely on land clearing will know which states to go to get the easiest permissions, but animals don't know where to go to be safe.
It's like it's always been, Shaun. Competition in the marketplace of habitat means only the fittest animals and birds and fish will survive. It's natural selection at its most natural and selective. Just like us humans having to evolve so we can survive extreme heat and no oxygen or water in the future, critters like these have to stop whinging and get on with mutating their cells to give them an advantage over other weaker animals, like this little fella here.
Yeah, but animals, you see, they don't understand what borders are, and it's not going to be a level playing field for every species, is it?
Let me give you an example, Shaun. Let's say that Myron here lives in Albury, Wodonga. He sleeps in a tree in Victoria, but he catches his fish in New South Wales. How's he going to survive? Well...
No, sadly, we don't have time for that right now.
Well, here's one I prepared earlier. Yeah? See? The front end has just as much chance of survival as the back. But if they work together, like a kind of national cabinet, they're bound to come out on top.
Anyway, that's coming up later, as is my dinner. Right now, I'd like to talk, though, about someone we don't often mention on this show, Alan Tudge. And the reason we don't mention him that much is because people think it's just one of our made-up names designed to get an easy laugh. But Alan's real, and he's been in the news for reasons that I think require some good old-fashioned plain speaking. OK, now Alan's our acting immigration minister, and it's fair to say that whoever you are, the portfolio of immigration changes a man. Philip Ruddock, young and vital and with his whole life ahead of him back in '96, turned into the Emperor Palpatine. Kevin Andrews, in the job for only a year, transformed into Nosferatu. Peter Dutton, a mere 4 years into the job, became Johnny Blaze. Even Labor's babyface Chris Bowen, immigration minister for just 3 years, ended up, for a while, looking like evil Spock in that episode where the USS Enterprise goes to a parallel universe. In fact, the only one the ministry has had no effect on whatsoever is Scott Morrison, who, some of you may know, went on to become our Prime Minister. But Alan, as acting minister, is caught between two worlds. Does he remain the very human, as the PM describes him?
Minister for congestion busting.
Or does he become the travesty of humanity that is often the fate of immigration ministers? Well, last week the federal court decided. They found that Alan had engaged in criminal conduct by not releasing a man in immigration detention after he was granted a protection visa, thus exposing Alan to civil and potentially criminal sanctions, including contempt of court. Now, another minister who's been through all this, of course, is Peter Dutton, who, when threatened with contempt by the same court and by the same judge over a question of a protection visa, handled it beautifully by caving in and doing what he should have done months before, instead of, according to the judge, showing unapologetic reluctance to take personal responsibility for his own non-compliance with the law and a lack of candour. So what advice can Peter, the master, give Alan, the student, in the circumstances? Well, to tell us, please welcome spokesiopath for the Home Affairs Minister, Brian Pegmatite. All right, that's enough of that. Come on, Brian, sit down. Now, Brian, can you tell us what it's like for a minister like Peter to have to be answerable to the law?
Oh, Peter is quite happy to work within the laws as they stand, Shaun, and to do his best to change them when they get in the way, like we're doing at the moment with asylum seekers' phones.
But it must be hurtful when a judge says you're unapologetically reluctant to take personal responsibility for your own non-compliance with the law and that you lack candour.
Alan needs to learn Peter's resilience to judicial oversight and being answerable to an authority greater than his own. For ultimately what matters is not the laws of mortal men, but Peter becoming Prime Minister.
Speaking of which, you must be pleased with the latest polls. The PM's popularity is up a point to 65% and up another point as preferred PM to 59%. So that's pretty good, isn't it?
Yes.
There's no point having a leadership spill in those circumstances, is there?
No.
And finally, last week, Peter announced he was ready to outlaw right-wing groups. Isn't that a bit ungrateful?
Well, it doesn't matter where threats to this country come from, Shaun, whether it's former Victorian Labor Health Minister Jenny Micallef or soon-to-be former Queensland Labor Deputy Premier Steve Miles or that Tamil family from Billawheeler, particularly the 3-year-old. Yeah. Peter's primary focus is on saving this country. For himself.
Well, thanks, Brian.
Pleasure.
Sunday night, there's another suspicious death in Northumberland.
Right. Thank you. Oh.
Confirmation from the coroner that the body in the woods is Jennifer Beefenby.
And I've just had confirmation from my doctor that the discomfort I've been having while straining at stool is because of piles. Right, I want a thorough search of the area.
That's Vera, Sunday, 8:30.
Welcome back. Well, as we know, COVID-19 has seen the government spending money like drunken sailors, shouting everyone, then smashing up the bar and then leaving the kids they haven't had yet to pay for the damage. But where are we going to get the kids that haven't been born yet to pay off the government's massive deficit, particularly given that...
Every year, about 300,000 babies are born in Australia.
I mean, that's enough babies to fill the MCG 3 times over. And given the cost of childcare, we might have to do that. In fact, given their size, you'd probably be able to get 200,000 babies in there if you bunch them up. And what an atmosphere that would create for an AFL Grand Final. Anyway, the point is that Australia's birth rate is rapidly declining. So what does that mean?
That means 56,000 fewer babies across the nation per year, a deficit some say could threaten the government's economic recovery.
Well, it's just all deficits with this government, isn't it? But fortunately, Josh is all over it.
The Federal Treasurer told the National Press Club in July the best way to boost the fertility rate was to make people more confident about Australia's economic future.
Yes, so romantic, isn't it? Jobs were up.
No, they were down.
An export boom.
To a halt, it growled.
Ah, yes, I remember it well. And what's more, a new support package looks set to be introduced in next week's budget. Later, I talked to Treasury official Wal Ballet about it.
Yes, Shaun, it's called Egg Seeker, and those men who access it are entitled to a payment of $150 per day for every day they stay home from work and have sex with their wife or girlfriend, or indeed both.
And are there any mutual obligations?
Yes. Those on Egg Seeker must apply for 8 acts of sexual intercourse a month.
And that interview coming up later. Before we go on, just a quick update from last week's show on the number of Australians presently stranded overseas. You might remember the figure we gave was 24,000.
23,000. 26,000.
25,000.
So just to confirm that.
About 27,000 citizens and residents.
That number again?
35,000 Australians remain stranded.
They must have listed those people on the stock exchange. Speaking of people flying back to Australia, we mentioned Badgerys Creek earlier and how 10 times what it was worth was spent on it. And I was wondering, Onus Cream from the Department of Infrastructure, how does this type of thing, indeed this very thing, happen?
Oh, honestly, Shaun, the property market is so volatile right now. These numbers just bounce around all the time.
So it might go up to 30 billion again?
Well, we're using it to build an airport, so probably not. No one's going to spend that much to put a stunning 5-star Eco House on the runway. You know.
Yes, it's also come out that formal briefings omitted key information, such as the purchase price and that it exceeded all known market valuations. Why didn't you tell the Minister how much it was going to cost?
Oh, that would just be gauche, Shaun, like leaving the price tag on a present and the look on the Minister's face when he found out what we'd paid for it. Oh, it was priceless until we had it revalued.
Labor governments were never this incompetent and or venal, were they? Or am I just being biased?
Oh, no. Not you. There is no need to mention Eddie O'Bead or the branch stacking up of Adam Rock.
Ah, yes. I remember it well. Now, we were also talking earlier about how
6 million homes and businesses will be directly connected to fibre optic internet, 7 years after the coalition rejected a similar plan by Labor.
Now, really, how are Labor supporters, if you can imagine such a thing, supposed to confidently loathe the coalition government when they keep implementing Labor policies like increasing welfare for the unemployed and connecting the NBN via fibre instead of copper? Spokes avatar for the Communications Minister and, like the new rollout, not a reference everybody's going to get, Hermione Gingold. Has the government shat itself over the introduction of 5G?
No, I don't believe anyone in the government has, as they say, coughed in their rompers here, Shaun. Communications Minister Paul Fletcher has made it quite clear.
We're now taking the logical next step in the evolution of the network.
Evolution? If mankind evolved like this, we'd be back to being protozoa about now.
Remember, Shaun, we didn't need fibre optics way back in 2013. But now, with the demand skyrocketing for high-definition pornography, we do.
Yes, but if you're building a new cemetery, you don't build it just for the people who are dead today. You build it to accommodate those who are going to die in the future.
Do you build a cemetery, Shaun?
Yeah, well, I hope you lot don't. You'll be digging up the graves again in a few years, so you actually put a few bodies in there.
This show's gotten meaner without the studio audience.
Ah, shut up. Well, coming up, another question. Shouldn't someone called Angus Taylor actually be making formal wear for cows? Plus, is trying to get the last 2 northern white rhinos in the world to mate by giving them an aphrodisiac made from powdered rhino's horn a bit weird? Also, I speak with someone from AUSTRAC about Westpac's record-breaking $1.3 billion fine for more than 23 million breaches of anti-money laundering laws and failing to stop child exploitation payments. It's a lot of money.
Absolutely, Shaun. The previous record was a $700 million fine paid by the Commonwealth Bank for its almost 54,000 money laundering breaches.
But the Westpac fine is only twice that, but for over 400 times the number of breaches.
Well, Shaun, it's so many breaches, we thought we'd give them a bulk discount. Plus, there's our loyalty program. For every failure to stop child exploitation payment fine, they get $399 free.
And what about this deal Westpac reached with AUSTRAC?
Economies of scale, Shaun. Standard practice when any law is consistently and systematically broken so many times, despite warnings and full knowledge that what they've been doing is illegal. You sit down with the perp in a boardroom, you ask what they think is a fair punishment, given our overheads and all the bad press they'll get if everything they've done comes out in court.
So AUSTRAC shakes them down.
Bada bing, bada boom. We're not in this business for our health, Shaun.
Anyway, that interview coming up later.
Hey.
Yeah.
You remember one thing, and this you better hear, right? AUSTRAC's the motherfucking one who calls the shots. You repeat any of this shit to anybody, you're going to lose a couple of fucking teeth. Capiche?
Yeah, absolutely.
Good.
Speaking of money, or rather lack of it, JobSeeker has fallen from $550 to $250 a week. But according to the government, these payments aren't meant to provide the security of, say, walking on a high wire. They are, as Social Services Minister Anne Ruston explained,
the safety net to help Australians whilst they find themselves unemployment, and we will remain absolutely focused on creating jobs so that we can get people off unemployment.
Professor of Pedantics at Box Hill TAFE in Orbspider, is safety net the best simile, given we've lowered it to below ground level?
Well, they can't have it too high, Professor Shaun, or there won't be any incentive for the people to keep their jobs. There needs to be that sense of falling should the worker's foot slip from the tightrope, a fear that they may plummet to their death, but for the safety net.
Wouldn't a safety harness be a better simile for JobSeeker, so that no one falls at all?
I think JobKeeper is the safety harness, Professor Shaun, and JobSeeker, the last-minute, 11th-hour Deus Ex Machina with a few holes in it that the performer has almost forgotten about. The government's logic being that if there's no sense of danger, then what's to encourage workers to keep their balance as they walk precariously along the high wire that is full-time employment?
Well, couldn't it be a little higher, though?
Too high, and then the audience can see it, Shaun. Then they won't enjoy the show as much. I mean, who's going to pay to see a circus freak lying around on a hammock?
What about the timing, though? Because there is a concern that for 400,000 unemployed who have to wait months for JobSeeker payments, the safety net with holes in it at below ground level has been installed after the tightrope walker has already fallen off and is currently lying on the ground in a nest of their own broken bones.
At the very least, it creates a new vacant position in the performing arts sector. As Anne Ruston says, Professor Shaun, it's all about creating jobs so we can get people off unemployment, or may God strike me...
Sorry about this. The person who does our special effects is on an RDO today. Thank you, Professor Ian. Now, the Treasurer has announced that the focus for next week's budget will be on jobs rather than a surplus because...
It would now be damaging to the economy and unrealistic to target surpluses over the forward estimates.
Now, on that, we have a question from our audience.
Oi, Tony.
Oh, that'll be it now. Yes.
Yeah, mate, this really hacks me off, mate. Bloody Frydenberg's been banging on for as long as I can remember, well, probably longer since that's only about 3 seconds, about the bloody surplus he was going to deliver, you know? And then some fucking jam comes along, what you can't even see, and he's like, oh, it's too fucking hard, I can't deliver a surplus, I mean, fucking cry me a fucking river like what that fucking whale swum up in the Daintree, mate. Did you see that?
No, I didn't.
Because, like, if the river, right, was made from, like, tears, it'd be salt water, mate. And then the whale would survive and everything. Like
well, that's a very good point. And your question? Oh, dear.
Mate, where do you want me to drop you off? I'm an Uber driver, mate. I'm not a fucking mind reader.
Well, let me ask you a question, if I might. Don't you think we should cut the Treasurer a little slack, given the deficit is due in large part to JobKeeper and JobSeeker?
Oh, whoop-de-fucking-do, mate. He's given us $86 billion. I mean, what about the impact on the country's fiscal metrics and our, AAA credit rating and everything like that? I mean, what about the fucking microscopic interest rates them banks are giving me on my fucking self-fucking-managed super-fucking-annuation fund?
Oh, you have a self-managed super fund?
I've got to, mate. I can't manage one myself, mate.
Well, you can imagine how excited we were on the eve of the budget to hear our Communications Minister, Paul Fletcher, come out and say public interest journalism is important now more than ever. You can also imagine our disappointment when we read the rest of the article and saw that he said this as he was giving $5 million to Australian Associated Press. Not a bad investment for something that sold for $1 back in June. I mean, Paul, if you're watching, if the government wants to throw taxpayers' money away, the ABC can give you a far worse return. But it does raise the question as to whether we really need the ABC at all. Surely, the argument goes, commercial television can do everything the ABC does and make money. In other words, why drink water free out of a hose when you can go into a shop and buy a can of high fructose energy drink? You want a comedy making fun of the news? You got Have You Been Paying Attention? You want a Logie-winning game show hosted by a so-called comedian? You've got Talking About Your Generation. As for news, well, you have so many choices. There's really no justification for wasting taxpayers' money on yet another version of it over here. And then there's the perennial question of whether we're biased. Well, according to the chair of the ABC board, Ita Buttrose, we might well be. Now, obviously, it would be self-serving to have someone like Ita on to talk about this, which is why we've arranged exactly that. Ms Buttrose, do you think we're too biased here at the ABC?
Well, I announced we were when I was a few weeks into the job, but I'm not sure. I really should mount some sort of internal investigation to see if I'm right. Crunch some numbers, maybe put it to air. Annabelle and Waleed could host it.
Well, bias depends on your perspective, though, doesn't it? I mean, if Gerard Henderson's watching Insiders, he'll say it's lacking Gerard Henderson. Whereas if Karl Marx is watching Death in Paradise, he's going to think it's a bit lightweight and pointless.
Well, to be fair, I think everybody thinks that.
Yeah, true.
The thing is, it's hard running a public broadcaster. When I was editing Cleo for Kerry Packer, the only thing I had to worry about was making sure the staples didn't end up on Jack Thompson's wang.
Yeah, I feel you.
It's just so difficult to please everybody. I mean, we got rid of Jones and, to a lesser extent, Cassidy, and then we got Spears in, which you'd think would shut them up over at The Australian, but no.
Yeah, those Johannes Leak cartoons don't even make any sense.
And your show doesn't help, from what I've read about it on the complaints log.
Well, it's all relative, Ms Buttrose. I mean, be fair, our show's nowhere near as biased as Charlie Pickering's. If you're thinking of getting rid of a show, I would definitely be looking into that one. And that one Lee Sales hosts at 7:30. Can't remember what it's called, but it's very bolshy.
Well, I saw that sketch you did earlier, making fun of Peter Dutton. I thought that was biased.
Well, that was Tosh's idea. I told him not to do it. You should sack him.
Well, why don't you ever do anything about what a good job Peter Dutton's doing?
Well, with all due respect, if you wanted some alternate reality, you should have recommissioned Clever Man.
I just think you should have some jokes every now and then about what a terrible job Labor is doing governing this
country. Sorry, I'm losing you. Can't hear you.
Do some jokes about how Albo talks funny. Say he sounds like a cross between Daffy Duck and Sylvester the Cat.
Can't hear you, Ita. Sorry, the broadcasting towers are so old. Bloody funding freeze.
What?
The peacefulness of a picturesque English county is threatened when millions of its residents are brutally slaughtered. Midsummer Genocides, Sunday, 8:31, followed by the mildly irritating Plunkett and McInerney.
Well, coming up before Utopia to let us know what's happening later in the week.
Next up, it's time to get out the superglue when icy conditions get the better of the experts as Antiques Roadshow pays an ill-advised visit to the Brickdelsbean Glacier. Then get ready for an uncomfortable half hour of silence when nobody remembers to turn up and couldn't read or answer the questions even if they did, when You Can't Ask That finds out all about illiterate mute amnesiacs. Followed by Landline and Station Close and Sell-Off, as recommended by the IPA.
And finally, as we know, Westpac was last week fined for breaching the Anti-Money Laundering Act, copping a fine of $56 for each of its 23 million breaches and resulting in the biggest fine this country has ever seen. Now, I'm not going to sit here in judgment of Westpac. We all make tens of millions of mistakes that jeopardise the lives of children and fund terror cells. But I do want to point out that each contravention can attract a maximum penalty of between $17 and $21 million. And that even at the lower end, that would have added up to a potential maximum fine of $391 trillion. So thanks, AUSTRAC. Your settlements just cost us the biggest surplus in the country's history. Goodbye.
Giant baby.